I want to thank y'all all for being here today. It's a great crowd, and thank you for Rotary for coming today. And very much thank the New Albany Garden Club for the great lunch and all the other things they do for the museum. And I know a lot of you Rotarians came because our speaker today is a classmate of many of you. I've only known Joe Edd Morris since I moved here 20 years ago, but I thoroughly enjoyed his first book, Land Where My Fathers Died. And so today we'll learn what happened to Cal in the sequel, The Prison. So we've had almost 20 years to kind of stew about that. But Joe Edd is a Union County native and a graduate of New Albany Schools. He's a counselor and a column writer, and well, he's just had a very interesting life, a lot of interesting things. He's written other books, The Christian Right, Neither Christian Nor Right, Things I Wish Jesus Had Not Said. What an interesting title. And another novel, The Last Page. And he's working on a book about his mother. And I just think it's very interesting, all the writers that New Albany has produced. You're in tall company. Well, there'll be a book signing following today's programs, and the proceeds of the signing will go to the museum, for which we are very grateful. And just as a side note, we're planning a series on memoir writing in the future, so it sounds like you're involved in memoir writing yourself. So, well, join me in welcoming Joe Edd Morris.
Thank you, Jill. It's been a long time since a few years since I've walked through this museum. And I could walk through it in an hour back then. I came over early today at 11 o'clock so I would have an hour to walk through the museum. And I think I touched maybe a tenth of it. So it's really done well under your leadership. And I think it's a tribute to our community. One of my first courses in seminary was Christianity and Literature. And the first item we had to read was A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor. So I think your folks are on to something. I thank all of you, each of you, for coming today. I was walking around looking at the exhibits and the writers that were there, and it was really humbling. I'm even more honored to be here because I can't hold a candle to these people. And so it's nice to be in such good company. And it's great coming home. I don't know what Thomas Wolfe's problem was with Asheville, or Asheville's problem was with Thomas Wolfe, but I know that I can come home anytime I want to. And home is not very far away. In fact, the first home that we had in New Albany was over on Apple Street. Tommy Shannon's house the Shannon house was down at the corner, and Steve Jackson was up. I don't know whether they were living there or not, but the only thing I can remember about that experience was being in a 4th of July parade and riding in a little red wagon. And I remember running out the door of the house buck naked, and my mama hollering for these two neighbors of ours to come catch me and bring me back. And the two neighbors were Tommy and Charlie Hall. And I'm glad I can't remember some things. But anyway, and then the second place that we lived was right over here on Adams Street. I drove by there today to make sure that I got it right. But we lived in a duplex. And if you're looking at the structure's still there. It's been remodeled probably numerous times. But we lived on the left side, and right next door to us was Helen Hill, who became one of my mother's best friends. Across the street were J.D. and Lena Beard. She was my godmother. And around the corner was Otis Speck Rogers. And that was my mother. And trying to promote anything, but I just find it interesting. And as I was driving down the street today, I was also making sure that I got it right. I grew up in an area of town called the North Side. The streets were named for presidents, most of them. As a teenager, I rode my bike all the way down to the GM&O railroad tracks where the streets of North Side began, and followed them back north, noting the names as I went. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and then Monroe, and then Jackson. Well, another Adams was supposed to go in there, but I guess they decided they couldn't put Adams in there twice. So Jackson, and that's where my house was, right there. I continued up to the next street, and I read the sign. I said, I don't think that was a president. I wasn't sure. A 2-block street named for someone named Peterson. I had memorized the names of presidents in 6th grade. Mattie Thompson had us do that. Susan, you're on the other side of town. I pulled out my World Book Encyclopedia. No president named Peterson. My father and my mother had no idea why the street was named Peterson. Because if you go on up, this president start again. So it's out of sync. I felt compelled to find out. Surely there was a story behind the name. I never solved the mystery. And over time, as I grew older, the intrigue just kind of slipped away. And then, many years later, one of my heroes and one of the people in my life that I looked up to, he knew I was writing something about New Albany. It was one of the first novel was about New Albany. And so he slipped this article to me that was out of the Gazette. And I read it. And I want to share it. Do you remember Aunt Rose Peterson? Aunt Rose was reportedly a former slave of about 100 years old. About the middle 1920s, she was the cleaning lady for the Bank of New Albany. Each day she would walk to the bank after closing time and perform her duties and then walk home coming up Cleveland Street. She wore long dresses and was rather heavy and wore an old worn-out scarf and large men's brogans. She also had difficulty walking and used a heavy wooden cane. But Mike, not as one as shiny as yours there. All of the kids in the neighborhood would wait for her at Jackson Avenue and ask her each day if she had anything to give them. Her usual answer was, "Get out of here, chillin'. I ain't got nothing for you." She would wave her heavy walking cane in a threatening manner, and all of us kept our distance. She would plod on a few more steps and stop and reach in her her big old cloth bag and pull out a small piece of candy. And one by one would call at us and hand us a candy and say in her gruff voice, "Now get out of here." She was so well known and highly thought of that the Board of Aldermen changed the name of the street 1 block east of Jackson Avenue to Peterson Avenue. Aunt Rose lived in the house that still stands directly behind the house on the northeast corner of Cleveland and Peterson. I remember Aunt Rose. The article was written by William Bill DeVan Blizzard. Ingemar, give me the name. Arantine Stevens. It's nice to have my amen corner here. You would think that I would have already been just typing up a storm and rolling those sheets off a typewriter, and I would have already had all this stuff accumulated, but I didn't write a lick until I got somewhere else. In 1961, I was appointed as the associate pastor of the Drew Methodist Church in Drew, Mississippi in the Delta. And I transferred from Ole Miss to Delta State. The head of the director of the Wesley Foundation at that time was a former teacher of ours, Ellis Tucker. And so I felt at home in that way, but the Delta was something completely different than I had ever experienced in my life. There was something about its, something mystical about it, something about its ambiance. The land seemed to have a soul of its own. I was inspired to write. And I don't know really how it came from. I was not in love with anybody, but I wrote a poem. And I sat in the library and I worked on that poem. I tried to make it a good sonnet. 3 quatrains, rhyming, iambic pentameter, a rhyming couplet at the end. I mean, I was trying to get it just right. I was really into it. First thing I'd ever written, ever, except term papers. And I wanted to show it to somebody, but I didn't want to take it to show to my left brain grammatically correct English teachers. So I walked across the quadrangle to the art department, and my art teacher over there, I was taking a class in art, his name was Malcolm Norwood. Malcolm Norwood is a prominent Mississippi artist. He's deceased, but he rose to prominence in his time. And I remember handing him that poem. And he took it and he looked at it. And he looked at it again. He looked up and I thought, oh me, this isn't good. He said, can I have this? I said, well, sure. I mean, I don't know what else I'm going to do with it. He said, let me have this. Gave it to him. Didn't think anything about it. A year passed. Forgot about it. He bumped into him on the quadrangle one day, and he said, Joe Edd, come over to my office. So I walked over to his office, and there was a magazine splayed open on his desk. And he flipped it over to show me the front that said Delta Review. It was a literary journal back then. I think it's defunct now. I'm not sure. And then he opened it back up again and pointed his finger, and there was my poem. That's when it started. And I started writing poetry, really bad poetry. I think only 2 were published. And then I kind of lost interest in the writing part. I was reading a lot. And then I met Sandy. And Sandy was reading some of my stuff. And she liked it. She said, this is pretty good stuff. And I thought, well, maybe I need to keep doing this. So the first novel was coming, the title of it was Coming for to Carry Me Home. And Francis Patterson, some of you may remember Francis Patterson from Tupelo. Francis was a good friend of ours, and Francis said, you got to meet Evans Harrington. Who's he? He's head of the English department at Ole Miss. I felt that I was not good enough to meet the head of an English department at Ole Miss. But she said, I'm going to set up an appointment with you. She made sure that he got the manuscript. And we sat on the porch of Square Books upstairs. And he told me that there was some really good stuff in here, but this is the novel that you've written to learn how to write a novel. In other words, it wasn't going to make it. So I put that aside. And I stopped. I probably hit it anyway. I'm just waving my hand all over the place. I started working on another novel, and just to I'm sharing this with you to give you an idea into the process of writing and how it moves along and how it stops and it moves along again. I was talking to a guy one day who was from Tippah County. I said, where do you live? He said, I live on the Weaning Hill. I said, the what? He said, the Weaning Hill. What in the Sam Hill is the Weaning Hill? He said, it's a little hill up there in Tippah County. He said, I can't tell you exactly where it is, but I said, why is it called the Weaning Hill, though? And he said, well, my parents let each of their children use the Weaning Hill to get started, and once they got started, they had to leave it and let the next one come along and take it. You can bet I wrote that down. That was a beautiful story there. And I took that and developed it thematically. the concept of dependence, not just on the land, but dependence on people, dependence on the bad parts of religion and other things, and weaved it into what I thought was a credible piece of work. But other people didn't think so. Just sent it out to agents, and they said it was too quiet. Well, it's one of Sandy's favorite novels, and if it's one of her favorite novels, I don't care if it's never published. But, you know, I like to go back and read it every once in a while and see what was the good part. What were the good parts? So one day maybe I'll send it out again, but right now it's sitting on the shelf. The Weaning Hill. Then the next one, and you'll remember this, was called An Absence of Motive, but that's not how it started out. The title of it was Murder in the Dorm. I was teaching psychology at Northeast. I was also teaching speech. And of course there was a young lady bludgeoned by a rifle, a drill rifle. And I'm going to cut to the chase here. They called, because they knew I was up there and they knew I had done some psychological forensic work before, they called me in to be the psychologist to try to find out who really did this. And I would walk, and it was in the Jackson papers, it was in the papers everywhere. I remember that first Sunday going in my Sunday school class, and I said, y'all don't look at me. Just don't look at me, because if you look at me, I may put you in a trance for a year, and you won't remember anything that happened. Well, somebody was interested in that one. The wrong people were interested in that one. I felt it was a credible piece of work, and I sent it out to some agents, and an agent, one particular agent said they were very interested in it. And then I started getting these phone calls from principals who were involved in the action of all this, wanting to read the manuscript. Bottom line, I pulled it. I didn't want to deal with a lawsuit. So it's sitting on the shelf. An Absence of Motive. I may float it out again someday, it depends. And then the next one, in writing that novel, Evans Harrington read everything that I was writing. He became my mentor and was a tremendous help. When we got down to the last page of that novel, he said, Joe Edd, that's where you hit your voice for the next one. That's where you hit it right there. And the next one became Land Where My Fathers Died. And how that unfolded is interesting to me. Evans and Betty Harrington and Sandy and I were sitting on our pool house porch, just sitting one evening having a glass of wine. And Evans told this story about the descendant of Confederados. These are the people who went to Mexico and went to Brazil and other places. Some even went to China at the collapse of the Confederacy, about how this one descendant of a Confederado tracked his kin down and found out that they were in Brazil. And he found out the village they were in, and he found out the street and the house that they were in. See, I told you. And then he walked up to that house. Now, this is 1865, 1866, and we're talking about 1970s. And he knocks on the door, and this little face opens up. The door opens, and he sees this little wizened face. And she says in Portuguese, "Who are you?" And he tells her in English who he is. And she said, "Why didn't you say so? Y'all come on in." That little fragment of conversation that night was what launched this book, because I was going on mission trips to Mexico, and I was reading Cormac McCarthy and all the pretty horses, and I was enamored with all of that. So anyway, that's how Land Where My Fathers came to be, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. But then I wrote one called The Jury Consultant, because that's some kind of work that I do. And it's a situation where a guy is a jury consultant and his wife ends up on the jury panel in a criminal trial, and all of the issues and problems with that. Wouldn't you like to read something like that? I enjoyed writing that, I think, more than anything else I've written. But the publisher were not interested in it. They said it's too convoluted. It's not, that wouldn't happen. Well, it could happen, and it has happened before. And then I wrote 20 Mile Bottom. And 20 Mile Bottom happened when I was in a workshop, a psychological workshop in Jackson, Mississippi. And a psychologist told a story about Tarleton County, Georgia, how they had disability fraud over there because there were 500 people that were diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenics. And of course it was fraudulent. This was all made up just to draw a check. Well, I took Tarleton County and lifted it up and plopped it down in 20 Mile Bottom. And I wrote a novel about it and a gypsy queen who became the queen bee over there. And I think it may see the light of day sometime. And then the last page about the what happened to the resurrection story in the Gospel of Mark, that page. I won't go into all of that. Greater love, guess what, folks? Coming for to carry me home. Way back there, Evans Harrington said, this is the one you wrote to learn how to write. It morphed into 3 or 4 different novels. And finally, after rewriting it, I decided to come up with a different approach. And I think someday it will be published. I've got a good publisher now who believes in my work, and perhaps it will come out. We'll see. And then the prison. And the prison came out of land where my father's. How am I doing on time? Okay. Prison, I'm not going to read all of these. Remember the story I told you that Evans told us about the guy going down? We were in a Sunday school class one time talking about Lazarus rising from the grave, and somebody's cell phone went off, and they said, "That's Lazarus calling." I apologize for that. Well, let me just read this to you. She took the letters. Bill, I told you, I don't work this thing really well. She took the letters, adjusting herself as if she were missing her bifocals, and read. She watched the pale hazel eyes move slowly. He watched the pale hazel eyes move slowly down each page, watched them widen and the pupils grow larger, and her mouth open and drop further open, and the wrinkles spread out over the amazed face, until she was finished, and her hands and the papers in them collapsed in her lap. "Well, I'll declare," she said, "if that doesn't beat all." The accent was there along with the idiom, the homegrown phraseology passed down through the generations of his parents and theirs before them, and further back still, and all of it voiced once more, an echo blown down the canyon of years, and he trembled at its sound and smiled. And she took out the towel and wiped his face, brushed away the tears that came unhurried down his cheeks. I can't ever get through that. Still there. So, it's got nice catchy tunes, you know. I've worked in 2 private maximum security prisons. I worked in one for a year in Tutwiler, and I worked in one for about 4 or 5 months in Marshall County, Mississippi. And that is not what inspired this book. I knew that I was going to do a sequel, to a successful sequel to Land Where My Fathers Died. By the way, there were 2 after that. There was one called Inherit the Land, and another one called The Will, and none of the publishers or editors were interested in any of that, so that's stuff sitting on the shelf. But I don't throw anything away, and I can always go back and borrow. But I wanted to write something about Joe Shelby Ferguson, but he marries Athen, who's the heroine, in land where my father's died. And later in years, she tells him he needs to change his name, that Joe Shelby is just not a good name. And he wants to know why. And she said, well, first of all, you're named for a Confederate general, and that's not exactly in vogue these days. And then she says, also, Joe is a girl's name, you know. And so she said she came up with Shelby. Well, he didn't want to be named Shelby because that was the name of a prison farm in Memphis, in a one-horse town in the Delta, so he didn't want that name. So he decided on Shell because Shell was something that protected. So Joe Shelby's morphed into Shell. And he's 79 years young. And the story begins like this. And if you looked at the cover, I always struggle for the cover to mirror the story. And in Land Where My Fathers Died, you'll see in this one, you'll see this is a photo that I took one morning when I was on a mission trip, climbed a mountain so that I could get there, see the sun coming over Popocatépetl, Popo they call it, in Mexico. And the sleeping woman, you can see that there's an outline of a woman that's sleeping. And she is upset because her lover has gone off to war, and she hears that he's been killed in war, so she lies down to die. He comes back and finds out that she's dead, so he sits over here mourning her. So, but this picture mirrors the theme of the story. And I tried to do that with this book here as well. So with that in mind, Shell Ferguson drove slowly along the stretch of blacktop, his eyes focused on the curious shapes ahead. He had lived his entire life in the Mississippi Delta, but never fully adjusted to its flatness. The endless monotony had a haunting way of playing tricks on his eyes. The midday sun shone brightly in the clear blue dome, but not warmly. It was late November, Thanksgiving Day, and cold. 2 months before, he would have seen rows of cotton and soybeans flicking by in geometrical precision, acres of milo and wheat and rice. Now, drab fields of stubble stalks lay busted in discs, bleak and barren. Along the hedgerows and creek banks, shattered trees scratched the sky. He crossed old bridges over old rivers, serpentine across the limitless alluvial plain. He passed gum-choked bayous and stands of cypress along channels of sloughs, motionless black water going nowhere. No music from this flat-lined land, as if time was in limbo and it was waiting to be time again. He's going to see his grandson, Cal, who is a Methodist preacher who's been wrongly convicted of a murder he didn't commit. So Cal's on the inside of the prison and Shell's on the outside, but what Cal doesn't know is that his wife and 6-year-old daughter and his grandmother, Shell's wife, were killed in a house fire, a strange and mysterious house fire. And so Cal is not dealing with it. He's struggling to deal with this. I remember Evans Harrington, when he read the first draft of Land Where My Fathers Died, he was not impressed. He said, I said, what's wrong with it? He said, well, you're too easy on this guy. Everything happens too easily. You got to be tougher on your protagonist. You know, make him be challenged. Make him have to push hard to go through difficult situations. So I took the manuscript back. I reworked everything. Took it back to Evans. He read it. He says, Joe Edd, I said you need to be tough on him, not kill him before he gets there. So I had to go back and rework it again a little bit so it wasn't too hard on him. My mama told me, she said, if he gets in another fight, I'm not reading anymore. Well, anyway, Cal is struggling. But Joe Shelby gets up one morning to go down to investigate the fire in the parsonage. Dawns were always better for him than dusks. And there was nothing like the delta at dawn, nothing like it anywhere. That first flush of light on the horizon, straight as if God had laid down a ruler and drawn it. The first shaft shooting upward from behind it like a bomb going off on the other side of the world, firing the clouds jonquil and pink and orange until the whole eastern sky seemed on fire. Then that first cusp of light, old as time, bright as a welder's arc, bulging into the fading dark, its rays streaking across the flatness, and you seeing them before anybody else in the world, before they struck beaches or ocean waves or touched the tops of the great mountains, because there was nothing in between to stop them as they raced that true and straight across the earth, that pure and unobstructed and undefiled. Little glimpse into prison life. Doesn't smell good, doesn't look good, doesn't sound good. It was dark in the cell when Cal opened his eyes. Only meager reflected light from the outside security and indoor pod lights that burned 24/7. A loud buzzer had signaled the 3 a.m. count. Each time he awakened in the cool, empty solitude, smells of body odor, feces, urine, and flatulence assaulted his nose as his vision reconstructed the world around him, his eyes colliding first with the black steel bunk overhead before the rest of his small new world fell into place. He had been there a week, but it seemed like years. In that brief scan of time, you'd think he'd know where he was when he woke up. When he got out in 20 years, would his senses have to readjust all over again? Prison life so stamped upon them. In his world of sheltered grief and solitary anger, did it even matter where he was when he woke up, just as long as he woke up? He kept hoping each time he went to sleep he would awaken and, like a fever breaking, the pain would go away. But each time he awakened, he was slammed anew by grief, by memories powering up from the darkness within. He kept waiting to hear the sound of his soul, but nothing came from that dark night. Now that the momentum picks up just a touch, I don't want to give anything away here, but maybe this will help. Because I'm taking us across the levee now. Any of you have hunted down there, you know that territory. Through the gloom of canebrake and dormant wood and shadow, the first thing Cal saw was the oxbow, some ducks skimming the surface, quacking. The voices he'd been hearing were louder. He smelled coffee and caught a whiff of frying bacon. Then the sun came smoking up through the mist over the levee behind him, the moving edge of the levee's receding shadow falling lower, a dark blade sliding incrementally, revealing the world in new light. Well, right toward the end, Shell and Cal have this discussion about what he's going to do, because he's been through quite a bit. Have you thought about what you might do once you're exonerated? Shell attempted. After a long delay in answering, Cal said, I've thought about it. Everything's been swirling around in my mind like a merry-round. I need to get off, but can't. You can when it stops, Shell said, and it will eventually stop. Time is on your side. Time, Cal sighed with a single nod, then uttered the word again and nodded again. Time is what I was serving. Now I'm out and still feel like I'm serving it. We're all serving time, son, Shell said. If you're living, you're serving time. Time is God's other name, and don't you ever forget it. No way to get around that big clock. Cal looked at him. That should be my line. I'm the preacher. Glad to see you still feel that way. You kept the faith. You survived. A pause. Cal thinking. Then, I don't know that I survived because I kept the faith, whatever that means. Sounds like protective custody, that if you hang on to it long enough, God will eventually bail you out. I survived because he sat there, molars grinding, jaw muscles rippling, rolling his hand as if the movements spun the rest of the thought. Shell sensed him struggling. What you're trying to tell me, Cal, is that faith doesn't sit on its haunches and wait. It has legs. Granddad, you're amazing, Cal said, looking at him with bright eyes. Now, at the end of the novel, there's an aftermath section where the author tells what happens to each of the main characters. And I'm not going to go through all of that, but the last few I wanted to share with you. How many of you have ever been in Clarksdale and eaten at the Ranchero? I see some hands. Yep. All right. Well, the Ranchero figures in this book rather prominently, actually. The Ranchero continues to serve its famous barbecue as it has since 1959. The levee along the Mississippi River still rivals the Great Wall of China. The levee road continues to serve as a travel option for the adventurous who want to drive on it from Illinois to Louisiana. And actually, Ann Rogers Dillard and her husband did that. And I got some of my information about that from them, too. I need to give them credit for that. The Mississippi Delta is as flat as ever and will always be the Delta. The prison is everywhere. Thank you for having me.